Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning. Give it another minute here. Paul said he's running a couple minutes late. Do we have Herman here yet?
Hello.
Hey, Paul. How's it going?
It's good. I think I need to sign in as host so we can share screen.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't look like we have Herman here yet, who is going to, I think, present the Multicluster robot project.
Okay. All right. Well, you know, just as a service for everybody, if anybody wants to share their screen for any reason, it's now enabled.
Awesome.
Okay, maybe we give it a few minutes for Herman. Maybe in a couple minutes we can just like talk about some of the use cases that are in cluster registry doc, and maybe Herman can demo in second half if he's not on by then. Sound okay?
Works for me.
Cool. How's everybody doing today? Yeah, I like it.
It's a nice sunny day here in Seattle, so that's good.
Excellent. All right, well, why don't we just go ahead and talk about some of those use cases that are in that doc. I know that you put a couple in there, Jeremy. Steven, I saw that you put one in there too. I dropped one in there. And we can just keep in mind that maybe we're time boxing that for now, you know, if Herman winds up showing up.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Do you want to share it or?
Yeah, let me drop a link into the chat. I'm on my phone, so like not easily able to share my screen, but I'll definitely drop a link in the chat. One sec.
All right. So yeah, I think the first couple I kind of put in as conversation starters in that doc, and they're really just things that we talked about a lot in the evolution of multi-cluster services. The primary one is, I think, the most straightforward thing in a cluster registry, which is identification. So, or at least it sounds the most straightforward. So in the past, there was a lot of talk around a cluster ID concept and what that could look like and various requirements. I think that may have been happening before we really had specific goals that we want to accomplish with that. So now we do with multi-cluster services, and there's a couple straightforward ones. Like obviously, I need a unique identifier for a cluster for it to for me to know how to reference it. And then with MCS, we kind of saw the evolution of the need that it be a valid DNS label. So there's a requirement. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of room to figure out what that could actually look like. But to have a cluster registry, it seems like you probably need some kind of cluster ID. But I want to make it clear that that may be separate from the previous cluster ID concept and some of the ideas there, although I think there was a lot of good thought that went into that as well. And then the other thing I think is also pretty straightforward, which is access. You know, if you have a cluster registry, you want a way to actually use that to gain some kind of access to each cluster in the registry with some set of permissions. But I think Stephen, do you want to talk about the ones that you added? Because I think that gets a little more interesting.
Yeah, so I sort of ripped off yours, Jeremy, a little bit on access control, but thinking about things that we've been wondering about in Submariner as well. So as a cluster set owner, I want to know who or what can access cluster information and add, update, or delete clusters from the cluster set. So that's basically just sort of thinking about well, general access control, but what it can be actually useful for. Then as a controller developer, I want a way for each of the clusters in my cluster set to access the cluster registry. Yeah, and so this is, right, so this is the inverse of your access point above. And here, this is more sort of thinking about high availability as well in terms of the cluster registry. If the cluster registry moves around, then we need to ensure that all the clusters in the cluster set can always access the cluster registry. And so that might mean, so I don't think it should involve providing access to all the potential cluster registry hosts to all the clusters in the cluster set, but it does mean finding some way of passing credentials around in a secure way, but that's sort of getting into the solution, which isn't the point here. And the last one, we're sort of...
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question about that is, I suspect from like my previous context on this, that on that second bullet that you put on there, Stephen, that there might be a number of people that have something that they would word that way, but it might be different from someone else. So I wonder if you might be able to maybe add some more details around like the specific use case facing you at this point.
Yeah, so this is based on Submariner, really, where we have a broker, which is effectively a cluster registry, and it can be hosted in a cluster that's in the cluster set or not, but all the clusters in the cluster set have to be able to access it. And thinking about how we can add high availability to the broker, one idea is to, because all the contents of the broker are replicated everywhere, any member of the cluster set can become the broker. The only requirement is that all the other clusters in the cluster set be able to access it. So that's a networking requirement and an access control requirement. So that's really where that comes from. And so if the broker moves around, then it has to be able to provide, well, the new broker has to provide access to itself to all the other clusters, which isn't obvious.
So I guess another question on that. So that explanation makes a lot of sense, but conceptually, I'm kind of wondering, like in this case, is the broker just happening to play two roles? Is it really so much that each cluster needs to access the cluster registry, or that the cluster registry needs to provide each cluster with access to the broker, which happens to be the same thing in this implementation, but may not be?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that sort of also leads into my third point, which is that we want to have it both ways. I got the impression, Jeremy, from your use cases that your idea was to have the cluster registry probably have connections going from the cluster registry to the clusters, but maybe I'm wrong there. And I know that's the sort of old federation model, whereas we have it sort of going the other way around.
So in the few items I had, actually, I didn't really specify that or how that would work at all. To me, the cluster registries, the only thing that is absolute or seems absolutely obvious in all cases for the cluster registry is that it needs some way of providing access to clusters. I don't know that it actually needs to ever connect to those clusters, right? It can just be essentially a store of credentials and addresses for clusters, probably with some other metadata that we need to figure out. But I don't know that it necessarily needs to talk to each cluster. There's some conversations about the work API, and obviously with federation, then you do, but I don't think that's a property of the registry itself.
So I think just to call out something that like Jeremy, you touched upon, I suspect there's probably like two broad categories at least of like how people think about something that they would call cluster registry. And maybe one category might be it's sort of like a shared well-known location to write things down, but it doesn't necessarily have any behavior itself, or has very, very minimal behaviors itself. And absolutely, like it's not in this document yet, but another kind of, well, might be getting there, touch it in some ways, but another kind of bin of how I would see people seeing cluster registry is that might mean to them both the like sort of a superset of the first category, where the extra content is like, I've got a way to push content to each cluster that's registered, or I've got a way to pull content into each cluster that's registered that's scheduled or coordinated in terms of the registry, if that makes sense. So like work API might be an example of one. And I just call it out because it's a gray area, and it's like one of the key differences that is evident to me in how people think of it from the past. So it's something that we deserve to just call out clearly and think about. And it's not necessarily that one's right or one's not, just so we all know what we're imagining.
Go ahead.
Nope.
I was just going to say in the submariner broker case, this the sort of the former. The broker is just just CRDs in a Kubernetes cluster somewhere, and there's no behavior in it. It's just data. But that's actually, so Jeremy, your point about the access credentials, that's something interesting I hadn't thought about. Having the access credentials in the cluster registry itself. Yeah, that would simplify things a lot. So
going back to that one about credentials in the registry, it's another one of the use cases that I think seems to make sense, but gets harder the more you think about it. So when we say access credentials, do we mean cluster root? Do we mean by service account? Do we really mean a token? Do we really mean credentials? Exactly what do we mean, and for who to do what? So for example, the way we captured it here, like access credentials, I think might mean to some folks, it might mean literally you've got like cluster root credentials hanging out in a registry. And it might also mean to someone else, like there's a flow that I can do to request the permissions that I need, and maybe I get a service account. So I think it's totally okay at this point to have like the level of detail that's in here. But I think part of being successful in building something that will like fill a need for people is to get very detailed about what exactly that means to people. And, just like we all have different perspectives, there's probably some things also that some people might say, I need this, and other people might say, I could never do that because I have a security problem with it or whatever. Makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, to
Yeah.
start, I think probably requiring that that there's something out there that gives root to every cluster is maybe not the best place to start. But I think it would be good to have people add uh, their use cases
Absolutely.
here, because I mean, obviously that's what this doc is all about. But specifically for credentials and what they're looking to need, like Stephen, it sounds like you've got some specific needs there. Um, versus trying to
Yeah.
decide what the right answer is for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Did we finish talking about the last bullet that Stephen added? The one that as a network administrator or cluster owner, etc.
Well, we didn't really start, I don't think, but that's
Oh, my bad.
basically it's just it's just saying yeah, we want to have it. So I guess this is already touching into some of the design assumptions, but assuming a non-passive cluster registry, then we probably need to deal with setups where the cluster registry can contact the clusters, but not necessarily the other way around, and the opposite, which is also related to your point, Paul, about I want to be able to register clusters that I may not be able to dial, but that may be able to dial me.
You know, one thing that's related to that is, I tried not to dump every use case I'm aware of in here, but it's kind of coming up, is the concept of wanting to understand. It's maybe not a health check. It's maybe more like, when was the last time I was able to heartbeat from a registered cluster to the hub in a kind of active situation, like the second bin where it's more than just a passive list. I wonder if anybody had use cases that might come to mind as I mentioned that.
I mean,
Well, I think that,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
sorry, I think something like that is essential. And the multi-cluster service design includes the idea of those leases for exactly that reason, right?
Right.
Yeah, Paul, when you mentioned health checks and stuff, I thought about the work that I don't of course I'm new to this group and I haven't ramped up on that context, but the work done by Virtual Kubelet in order to do multi-cluster that way, right? Because it very much does sound like what else has health checks, right? Nodes have health checks. So clusters as nodes would also seem like it fits that use case. I'm not sure if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. You want to know which nodes in your cluster are available and what their status is. It makes sense that you'd want to understand the overall status of a cluster that you had registered. Is that maybe a good paraphrase of what you said, Richard?
Yeah, like I guess if we were, I mean, of course, if we were to design or rethink this cluster registry, we should, compare it to the existing work of, I guess, how other people have looked at multi-cluster services or multi-cluster topologies. Virtual Kubelet definitely does seem like something that people have been exploring, and like, how would we solve that same use case but differently?
Yeah, I think there's also there will be sort of analogs or precedents that we can look to for patterns around how things work in Cube that we might analogize into the registration concept. Absolutely, we should keep an eye on that one. Richard, while you're talking and you got a hot mic, do you want to talk about your use case that's in this doc?
Yeah, sure. I guess this really came from our, calling back to my presentation a couple of weeks ago, about how, you know, the idea that an application developer, if they need to, should be sort of abstracted away from the cluster topology, and that has its roots in sort of like designing a good blue-green experience for a cluster rather than individual workloads, and what that would look like. So if I choose to, or under certain specific circumstances, like blue-green, I would want to be able to provide that experience where a developer never has to worry about the ground shifting underneath their feet. But of course, as an SRE or as a cluster engineer, I also would like those knobs and dials that I can then automate on top of. So those seem like they're in conflict with each other, but of course, the cluster developer is the one providing the experience for the application developer. So I'm just thinking about how we can sort of harmonize that service to service communication, or perhaps even service discovery, through a cluster sort of cluster registry, and I guess by extension service registry.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot there. I think there's some really good points. It kind of sounds like there's two separate things, right? There's that service registry concept. So I just want to talk to a cluster that runs this service, and then there's the idea that as an application developer, I want to talk to the cluster I'm supposed to be talking to right now, regardless of state of, for example, a blue-green upgrade. So, but then obviously as SRE, I want to talk to actual clusters. So maybe there's some way of like label selection on clusters like that we're looking
Right.
for here. And
yeah, definitely.
So there is another document that we have open for use cases for the cluster set, and I feel like we're touching that one. I wonder, as sort of a meta point, like, does it actually help us to have multiple documents for this, or should we just make this one the dumping ground for now, and we can sort of bin them and categorize them later? What do people think?
I think a single doc is probably easier, especially this one's getting some traction now. And
Yeah,
it seems like the cluster set itself as a concept and some form of registry are going to be pretty coupled. So if you don't need any knowledge of other clusters, there's probably still some uses for cluster set, but I would bet that most real cluster set use cases require some knowledge of other clusters.
Yeah, I also agree, because especially because we're trying to collect use cases, I guess cluster set, the differentiation between cluster set and cluster registry would require someone to understand what the difference is between the cluster set and the cluster registry is, while we can really be rejigging our concepts and our abstractions to fit their use case rather than the other way around.
okay. I put a note into this doc for myself to go back and make sure that we plumb the other document into here and add a link into this one. Okay. Did we want to keep talking about Richard's use case, or I see Stephen, you've added a couple about health.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking sort of based on what the one that you just added about health as well. But yeah, I agree. The cluster registry, cluster set distinction is perhaps a bit early in the process if we're just recording use cases. So yeah, on the health side of things, and so this is also blurring the distinction between registry and set, I guess. But I think it's important for clusters to be aware of the health availability of the cluster registry, which is the opposite of your point. And I also think it's valuable to try to keep this up. The same properties we have in networking with control planes and data planes. If the cluster set is the data plane and the cluster registry is the control plane, if we lose the control plane, ideally the data plane should still function.
So drilling into that first bullet, Stephen, how would you expect to surface in a registered cluster the availability of the registry? Would you see that as something that that's more programmatic, or does it have API? What would you expect?
I was thinking more along the lines of programmatic rather than API. So actually, I was thinking of something like actually synchronizing the data. So still with the mindset of a passive registry, synchronizing the data that's in the registry and using something like Raft or the Kubernetes user election features to keep an eye on the cluster registry.
So from my own perspective, I could understand a frame of mind where it might be, where someone might want to be able to get that out of an API, like on the registered cluster. Does anybody think is that invalid, valid?
As a sort of externalizable property that might be useful, say, for a load balancer?
Yeah, or being able to present in a UI, maybe like the unplugged like emoji or graphic.
Yeah, I think I'm stuck on the wording a little bit. I think it's just that you want the ability to be aware of the health availability of the cluster registry in general. Seems like whether that's from some external, like a UI, or from one of the clusters themselves, is not entirely relevant, right?
Mm-hmm. Switching gears a little bit to the second one, because it's kind of related to like the one of the things that I heard repeatedly from folks in the past about federation was the perception, and I think it's valid based on what was implemented in the past, of like the cluster hosting federation as a single point of failure. And Stephen, I read your second bullet point here about surviving unavailability is connected with that.
Yeah, exactly.
How would you expect to survive the unavailability? I think there's kind of two different scenarios, right? You maybe go offline for a period of time and it comes back, like it blips, or it fails and maybe you already know where it will fail over to, like you have a comma delimited URL field for it. Tell me more about what you imagine there.
Right. So yeah. So the second case is a bit simpler. If that's more about replicating the registry and choosing another primary. Basically, the former one is a bit harder and sort of leads into split brains and things like that. So if a single cluster, so just to go back to sort of the use case, if I have an exported service inside a cluster set, I want to continue to be able to use it, even if the registry is gone. So that seems fairly simple, because once this exported service has been created and represented in whatever the appropriate way is in each client cluster, connected cluster, then if the registry goes away, that information is still there. The only danger is that it becomes stale. But then if the information becomes stale, presumably the target endpoints will stop responding, and so that sort of settles itself. And that also takes care of the completely disconnected cluster scenario, because the completely disconnected cluster won't be able to contact the registry, and it also won't be able to contact any exported services from any other cluster. And those were the two main use cases. We had a sort of other use case, which is a bit of a pathological networking scenario where a cluster set has a load balancer on top of it, and we want to sort of be able to route around failures and provide access to services in cluster, say in cluster B going through cluster A, because the load balancer can no longer talk to cluster B. So that's a bit of a sort of sub case. Yeah, then there's the whole sort of joining again, and that's all covered in with things like Raft and so on. Getting into implementation details, I think. But yeah, the two points you've added sort of capture what I was thinking of. Pretty much.
Okay.
Right.
So
even when you mention like if the cluster registry goes down, but also they're still able to use sort of stale information, that suggests to me like there's some sort of cache of information on each cluster, and I guess you would sort of incur the performance of that cached information and all of its pros and cons as well. Is that sort of what you were getting at?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. So I think in some ways, so the cluster registry. So we haven't really even talked about what the cluster registry contains. Is it just a catalog of clusters in the cluster set and access credentials, or is it more than that, exported services, etc.? Or do clusters swap services with each other, and so on? And so it depends on whether the cluster registry is just an initial step to contact the other clusters, or if it's the sort of canonical representation of the overall state of the cluster set.
Yeah,
in the latter case, yeah.
It seems like staying more minimal is better, and just really focusing on these use cases. If it turns out that it later makes sense to, for example, roll in some multi-cluster service functionality and tracking services, like maybe that's something that we could eventually get to. But that seems like we're getting way ahead of ourselves there, and also starting to force implementation, which we really didn't want to do with multi-cluster services. And like even some of the conversation we had there, I worry that we're getting a little too into specifics of how things would work. I think it is like what I'm really hearing there is that if you build something on that uses the cluster registry for connectivity, would it be enough to say, at least to start, that you want to make sure that if the cluster registry goes away, any services that are using credentials from that registry, for example, can still use those credentials, so it's not, a single point of failure?
Yeah. That's really what I want. I want to avoid the registry being a spot. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Because I think that making the requirement of replication, like obviously there should be some kind of replication in anything that you're relying on, but specifying that requirement seems like we're starting to say that
that's the solution.
Users should now assume that, and maybe an implementation that uses cluster registry should actually handle its own availability, but we just want to guarantee that credentials will still work.
Yeah, and I hear that as most essentially like availability in the presence of a partition. And Tim, I see your hands up. Do you want to speak?
Boy, howdy. There's a lot going on here, and I apologize if I'm a bit contrarian. I think the cluster registry topic is like the least interesting thing that we can talk about, because I think no user should ever care about the cluster registry. There's some set of admins who care about it, but the vast majority of people who are going to engage with Kubernetes aren't going to ever see or think about the cluster registry. And so I think it's a distraction a little bit. And when we start talking about, well, we haven't decided which model we're going to use for multi-cluster services, I think we're actually missing the thing that I liked best about Jeremy's multi-cluster services proposal was it doesn't dictate any of that. And I'm just worried that we will spend a lot of time rabbit holing on how multi-cluster registry should work and what API it should provide and how the credentials live, and we're making assumptions that don't actually help anybody. I think we haven't explored implementations enough to try to standardize on it. And things like credentials, which was just the last topic, like I can't make any guarantees about credentials because hopefully you're getting short-lived credentials, right? So whatever you pulled out of whatever API implements your cluster registry, hopefully that credential doesn't last more than a half hour. And so if the cluster registry goes away, like in some worlds, you're going to have a huge problem. In other worlds, maybe you've got eternally lived credentials, and I feel bad for you. But that's the way various implementations are going to work. And for us to try to standardize that now feels like turning left at Albuquerque.
So,
sorry,
Tim, in what I heard, I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly, is it sounded to me like you think cluster registry is kind of a strange attractor, distraction type topic. Most users ideally won't have to understand the properties even necessarily or details of the cluster registry. And it sounded to me like you think there's maybe better things we could be spending our bandwidth on. Accurate?
Yeah, I mean, put yourself in a user's point of view, right? I'm using a cluster and I want to engage with multi-cluster services. I don't want to care about the clusters in the cluster set. I don't want to think about where my cluster registry is. One of the things that is really elegant about the multi-cluster services design is I don't have to think about those things because they're just represented in my cluster, right? And via the endpoint slices and the service imports and whatever. And whatever other functionality we build, I think should follow a similar pattern so that the lion's share of users, end users, they don't know this stuff exists because it's not interesting to them. And if we build a multi-cluster workload management thing, which has been a topic to end users, there's an API that I talk to somewhere, and that API tells me what I should do, or it helps me schedule my workloads, or whatever the actual functionality ends up being. But I don't really care about which clusters are in or out, or how the controllers got their credentials. Now, to be sure, it's important to figure out if we want to write portable controllers, how are those controllers going to iterate the set? And how are those controllers going to get their credentials into the constituents? Or if those controllers are in cluster, how do they get credentials or connectivity, right? I think, Paul, you raised the issue here about not being able to dial. How do they get connectivity between those clusters? Those are interesting topics in the context of I'm a controller author and I want to provide some new capability, but end users, like they don't care. I think
Right. I'm wondering too, Tim, what you're saying, like, do those things even need to be standardized? Does a controller author does there need to be a standard way to get those credentials to other clusters, or can that be an implementation specific thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I imagine that we're going to eventually find a set of controllers that we really do want to standardize, that are going to be so useful that having a consistent way of getting credentials will be important. But I don't think we know enough to say that yet, to say what the requirements are, right? We've got exactly one
Yeah.
And even that, it like nobody's really shipped it yet. So we've got a bunch of people who are playing with one.
So in terms of
Yeah.
like framing, Tim, just for clarity, and probably this is something that I should have done to frame the conversation when we kicked it off today. Like we're not really here in this discussion to shift our focus as a group onto this as like an ongoing thing. But it is something that's come up in the last few meetings. And in general, we've kind of touched the topic over the last few months. So this is maybe more of like an exercise, I think, to start recording things that like people might think are important in the community as we make progress on what I think you would refer to as the more interesting parts of like multi-cluster services and work API, et cetera. So I don't want us to take a laser focus on cluster registry at this moment, but I think that we'll be kind of working backwards into finding over the next, I don't know, 6 months, whatever, some medium-term amount of time, near-term, medium-term amount of time into a desire for some shared primitives. So I explicitly want to say to everybody that I don't think that standardization is a goal for us right at this moment. It's more like let's think about recording what people have thought about in connection with the term, and as we go forward, see which of those things wind up being actual fits to the problems, the more interesting problems we try to solve. Does that make sense, Tim?
Sure, and I don't mean to come off as negative Nancy here. Like, it's an interesting topic, and it's actually sort of very difficult to steer away from diving deep on this topic because I have a suspicion that we're mostly infrastructure nerds here, and the infrastructure for the infrastructure is even more interesting. But I really want to focus on the things that bring value to end users and how different implementations will make different trade-offs around value propositions, right? And I think this is, like you said, a distraction from that goal.
Okay, Richard, I see your hands up.
Yeah.
You want to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of speak to, the topic that Tim brought up. So at our company, we have basically, application developers. So in my point, I say, as an application developer, as an SRE, but that's, I guess, sort of analogous to, as an end user and as a controller developer. So when I come into this conversation, I think of really three layers where an end user is certainly, and I'm always thinking about what the end user will see in terms of what resource they define or stuff like that. But I in my experience, it's also a very personalized or opinionated way of serving that customer group the best, right? So like as a controller developer, I write specific unique APIs and controllers to serve what they need. And then of course, when I turn around and I need some sort of maybe abstractions to build on, there's that third layer of where that infrastructure for me to build a platform to serve my users, I guess. That's sort of my perspective. I don't know if anybody else shares that or if that's a common sentiment.
I got distracted trying to manage hands in Zoom. So I'm not sure that I caught all all what you said. Could you TLDR?
Right. So basically, the way I see it is that there are 3 layers of users. There are end users, there are controller developers, and then there are underlying abstractions in which these developers develop on for their users. So I guess which layer are we discussing here, or is it the generic use case for all 3 layers? Or is it specifically for the end user?
So that's a really good question. Here's my version of that is that I think that our conversation in the past in general has sort of mixed those different concerns together. I hoped that we eventually can get to the point where those layers are like evident in our conversation, and maybe they have names that we all share for them, so that we can be very clear about like what are the actual use cases that people have for the different layers. Does that make sense?
Definitely, and it's like the basically like a persona document, right? Because like
Correct.
if we start like a persona document, I certainly have like, you know, I would have specific use cases specific to that persona as well, based on my understanding of my company architecture, or not architecture but hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think that is that would be great content to put in here, and maybe we need to just find like a better name for this document than the one it has presently. But I'm definitely interested in that type of information too, just speaking for myself.
And we actually have some sort of I actually have some sort of like internal like documentation that I've already written for myself that I can share for sort of inspiration and as a skeleton for these personas as well.
That would be fantastic.
Awesome.
Let's call on the raised hands, and then we're actually over time and running up on the hour, so probably we'll be winding this down after that. Stephen, I think yours went up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with Richard. So the way, when I was filling in the use cases in both documents, the way I was thinking of this is that the registry document is more about what I need to think of as a controller developer, and perhaps as a network administrator as well. So sort of with the Red Hat OpenShift bias of seeing everything with operators. So there's the operator that does the automation, but that also provides the status. And the cluster set document was perhaps more interesting to me, but more complicated to think about because it's more about the concept. And so it sort of combines 2 of Richard's layers in my mind, the concepts that we're thinking of and how cluster sets are useful for end users. And I agree with Tim, end users shouldn't care at all about the registry side of things in most cases.
Gotcha. And how about you, Jeremy? Your hand's up?
Yeah, I think that the everything that was just said is great. I think understanding the personas and who we actually care most about is key, and I think figuring out where we should focus the conversation most. And then, at a higher level, I'm wondering, like, maybe a good first goal is what from this registry, and maybe it's actually not a registry, so maybe pivoting back to the cluster set document makes more sense. But what assumptions can I make about clusters in a cluster set? We'd already talked about namespace sameness, and I think that one has a lot of consensus. But the first item I added here was cluster ID, because that's the one specific need that came out of MCS, and it seems like a registry related concept, because having a unique ID for each cluster, storing that in some registry makes sense, but it really doesn't need a registry. We just want a unique ID. And so does that actually make sense to standardize? I mean, it seems like if every MCS implementation is going to have some unique ID, maybe we can make certain guarantees around characteristics of that ID and how that actually gets derived. So maybe that becomes something that Kubernetes clusters have, just in general. But if that were the case, then is that even actually necessitating a registry? or is it just a tool you could later use for some operator to build a registry? So starting with the personas, I guess my TLDR is starting with the personas. I think is a good place there. And what do we really want to get out of this?
Yeah, I wonder. So I think starting with personas is a really would be a great idea. How about I just plumb something in here for personas into this document so we don't wind up with a sprawl of documents, and folks can just brain dump on personas in there. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, personas in use cases. So I'll plumb that in. I think we're about at time now, and I've got a hard start for my next thing at the half hour. So I personally have to drop now. Tim, I saw a comment just go into the chat. Did you want to verbalize it?
Sorry, I just wanted to say on cluster ID, I think cluster ID is one of the things that we do understand fairly well now, as we've had a bunch of different implementations of stuff and everybody comes back to needing it. But what if we can we define cluster ID the same way we define multi-cluster service? Like within a cluster, this happens, and that is your your cluster ID, and how that came to happen is undefined, at least for the moment. Like for example, you get a crypto signed, an object with a crypto signature from a CA that you trust, and how that came to be is out of scope, and that gives you your cluster's ID, and then all the sort of ripple of implications there, right? Refreshing certificates and revocation and all those other things. We can go and address the semantics of it. And then, a cloud provider can implement it against their cloud CA, and an on-prem provider can implement it against their on-prem CA, and integrations can be wide and varied and interesting. But we all agree on what the semantic is.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I think that's a very good place to start. And yeah, you kind of you leave a lot of flexibility to implementations, but you also punt a lot of the definition to those implementations. And really it comes down to if I'm using this tool, what can I actually expect in a cluster? Like what things can I count on? And we've done that with I think to good effect so far with multi-cluster services. If you're using an implementation, here's the behavior you can count on. And if you're using a cluster ID implementation, you have a provider, here's what you can count on, here's how you would find it, all of that. I think that's a great place to start.
And again, my idea for implementation is very hand-waving. I'm not a certificates expert. So somebody who knows better what certificate protocol would work best here would be great.
Okay, I've got to drop. I guess Jeremy, you and I should reach out to Herman and see if we can reschedule his time for a future meeting.
Yeah, I'll reach out.
Okay, and please, folks, write into the agenda doc if you have things you'd like to discuss next time, and we'll see you then. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Later.